I live in America and pay taxes here like the rest of you. I don't get to vote, but I do get to make videos. This is the financial crisis made easy. A load of banks in America invested, unluckily, about $1 trillion they didn't have. Now America is faced with a choice. You can bail out the banks, which basically means you give about $1 trillion to the banks to keep them solvent, or you can let capitalism take its majestic course with the deregulated markets. This means that the banks will fold, which will probably mean a Great Depression-style crash. If the banks go bust, they will take many of the small and medium businesses who are reliant on the banks for loans, financial support, storage, etc. with them. This will put a disproportionate number of people out of work, which means these jobless folk cannot spend the money that they're not earning, and the whole economy spirals into recession. Basically, this is the equivalent of throwing a big spanner into the economic works. So how much is $1 trillion, and can America even afford it? $1 trillion, that's about 10 times a bigger financial disaster as Hurricane Katrina. It's about 30 times as big a financial disaster as the 9/11 terrorist attacks. $1 trillion, that's $3,000 for each of the 300 million Americans in this country. That means that a typical family of four will have to pay about $12,000. This is the money you will have to pay for the bailout, one way or the other. $1 trillion is basically 1/3 of the entire US federal budget, so there is absolutely no way this can be absorbed into the metabolism of the US economy. There are three basic paths. One, you can decrease public spending. However, this would entail firing about 20 million government employees, each earning on average about $50,000 each, obviously leading to an economic disaster in itself. Number two, you can increase everyone's taxes by 30% for this year. Again, this would be an economic disaster. Three, you can put it on the national debt. This is, of course, assuming you can actually convince people that this is a debt that you will be able to pay back at some point. However, this merely forestalls the issue and burdens your economy with interest payments until you pay back the debt or your economy folds. So America is pretty much screwed whether it swallows this jagged little economic pill or not. It may be useful at this point to reflect on how the US markets came to be in this position. Put simply, lack of regulation. That's essentially the police of the marketplace. There is this naive notion, particularly among hardcore capitalists, that reducing the number of regulators and just letting the markets police themselves will be more efficient and therefore more profitable for all. The shortcoming of this reasoning should be clear to every American to the tune of $3,000 at this point. Basically, the regulators are an insurance against this sort of thing. If you were to pay your regulators an average wage of, say, $50,000 a year, you could employ 20 million of them for 1 year to stave off a crisis like this and still be cost effective. 20 million. That's about the same population as New York State. That's almost 10% of the population of the United States. The finger of blame here points squarely at those who have so vocally banged the drum of reducing taxes and reducing market regulation for so long.
I am concerned about the threat of excessive regulation.
We scaled back regulation and bureaucracy.
He knows we need simpler regulation.
Make a weed whacker to excessive regulation and mandates.
I think it really has to do, the fundamental difference is our view of role and the role of government in America. Everything he has supported is bigger government, more regulation.
I mean, I am less government, less regulation.
And we need less regulation.
Less regulation and less regulation. Our financial market approach should include encouraging increased capital in financial institutions by removing regulatory, accounting, and tax impediments to raising capital.
I don't think
frankly, someone who wants to increase the burden of government regulation and higher taxes has any real understanding of economics.
So what should America do at this point? Bail out the markets or not? To an extent, it really doesn't matter. Both options screw over America. But which is the lesser of the evils? Well, if you bail out the markets, you send the message that the government is willing to give the tax money of honest, hard-working people to either incompetent or corrupt businessmen who have, through their inept and maybe criminal mismanagement, essentially bankrupted their businesses in a deregulated marketplace. This will cost the average American about $3,000. This is a bad and expensive message to transmit, even if it does stave off a big recession. However, if you don't bail out the markets, it will be hard for America for the next few years. Expect a big depression. One thing is clear though, whoever wins the next election will be financially screwed. It will take several years for the US economy to absorb this financial disaster. This is reaping the economic disaster that was sown by market deregulation. The market deregulation that has been so strongly supported by Bush and McCain.
John McCain was against the government bailout of AIG before he was reluctantly for it. Here he was yesterday on the Today Show.
We cannot have the taxpayers bail out AIG or anybody else. This is something that we're going to have to work through.
Asked about the same topic today on Good Morning America.
I don't think anybody I know wanted to do that, but there were literally millions of people whose retirement, whose investments, whose insurance were at risk here, and they were going to have their lives destroyed.
Senator McCain appears to have changed his tune on regulation in a fundamental way. These days, out on the stump, he's a champion of reining in Wall Street with tough regulations.
We're going to put an end to the reckless conduct, corruption, and unbridled greed that have caused a crisis on Wall Street.
But for more than 25 years in the Senate, McCain has fashioned himself a champion of smaller government, less regulation.
I am less government, less regulation, lower taxes, et cetera, et cetera.
In the mid-1990s, he supported a measure to ban all new government regulations. McCain supported legislation a decade ago that broke down the firewalls between banks, investment houses, and insurance companies, the very rules that companies like AIG exploited to get into the current mess. And as recently as March of this year, after the collapse of Bear Stearns, McCain was all for deregulating Wall Street.
Our financial market approach should include encouraging increased capital in financial institutions by removing regulatory, accounting, and tax impediments to raising capital.
But just as it leaves a bitter aftertaste in your mouth to know that the taxes of honest workers, such as myself, are going to subsidize rich, incompetent, or corrupt businessmen, it seems downright perverse to elect a man such as McCain to deal with this crisis. After all, it was the short-sighted maverick policies of less regulation is better that he advocated that led to this financial disaster in the first place.
In 1999, you were one of the senators who helped pass deregulation of Wall Street. Do you regret that now?
No, I think the deregulation was probably helpful to the growth of our economy.
McCain's been an advocate of deregulation most of his career, but Thursday he endorsed the biggest bailout in history, a plan for the government to take on the bad debts of financial institutions.
We're going to take over these bad loans. We're going to take over these bonds, and we're going to keep you alive, and we're going to have the taxpayer help you out. But when the time comes and the economy recovers, then anything that's gained back is going to go to the taxpayers first. I'm not saying this isn't going to be messy, and I'm not saying it isn't going to be expensive, but we have to stop the bleeding.
But why would you let the Wall Street executives sail away on their yachts and leave this on the American taxpayer?
Well, it's not the greedy Wall Street people that I worry about, although I am, like most Americans, frankly, enraged.
The policies that this man has so strongly pushed for have just cost me, a fairly average American taxpayer, about $3,000. I'm really not terribly happy about that. Indeed, if I had a vote in America. You know, a little representation for all those taxes I pay. This is the sort of thing that would be a decisive factor in determining who I voted for.